Now that we've illustrated the risk environment and painted sort of the big picture of basic digital risks and vulnerabilities, I want to talk about specific types of risk and the tools and techniques we can use to mitigate each type. The first type of risk I want to cover is credentials risk, and this is a big one. The risk of having your login credentials compromised is arguably the most potentially problematic and damaging sort of risk that you can face. When I say login credentials, I mean the username and password you use to log into any kind of platform, whether it's your food delivery service or your bank account. There are many ways in which login credentials can be compromised, and that's everything from getting phished to poor password practices and using the same password all over the place, or not changing your password very often. Or it could be that you get pulled into a data breach at a big major third-party platform or store or retailer that you didn't have anything to do with, but now your username and password pair is out there up for grabs. Here's the good news. It is relatively simple to protect yourself from the vast majority of this kind of risk. And what we're about to cover shows you the best and most powerful tools and techniques you can use to protect yourself from this kind of compromise. Your best path to avoiding credentials compromise as an individual or within a small organization are the following. 1, using two-factor authentication. 2, using a password manager. And 3, learning to recognize phishing attempts. First up is two-factor authentication. Two-factor authentication is super effective. It's easy to use. In a lot of cases, in an organization, you can enforce it administratively for a lot of big platforms. And it is a super effective safeguard against your username and password getting compromised. Now, there's various forms of two-factor authentication, and all of them make it much harder for someone who has compromised your username and password for any kind of platform to complete that transaction and get in and actually start causing trouble. Two-factor via text message is the most common form. You're probably familiar with this. This is when you try to log in and it says, oh, hold on, I gotta send you a code. And you get texted a code, and it's usually like a 6-digit code, and then you punch it in and then you get to log in. This has varying levels of intensity. Sometimes you have to do that every time. Sometimes it's only if you're signing in from an unrecognized device. But while among the universe of two-factor authentication methods, it might be sort of the simplest and maybe the least secure, it is still way better than not having any sort of two-factor authentication applied to your account or your platform. A more secure version involves the use of an authentication app. That can be Google Auth or Authy, or some platforms have their own version of the app that's tied into your account. Basically, this involves the generation of a quick expiration access code that you have to have the app open on your device to be able to punch in at the website. It doesn't text it to you, because if you want something that's a little more secure, I suppose in a rare case your device or your phone might get cloned, or your SIM card could get cloned, and in that case someone could steal a text code as it comes through, but that's going to be fairly rare. This is, however, more secure, and it does make it much more difficult for someone to be able to get access to your account. The most secure, arguably, I would say, probably the most secure version of two-factor authentication involves the use of a physical USB key. It's about this big. They'll send you one in the mail, usually through a service. Google has a service where you can sign up for this through Google Cloud. Basically, unless you have that key inserted into whatever device you're trying to use to log into your account, no one is allowed into the account. That's pretty intense. But if you want the best that two-factor authentication has to offer, that's about as good as it gets. These methods are primarily for individuals and members of smaller organizations that don't have a fully fledged IT department or don't have an information security department. If you are in a larger organization and you have an IT department or an information security sort of administration that says, hey, this is how security goes, this is what we want you to use in order to access your devices and use our platforms, you always need to defer to that, because that's in an ecosystem, and adopting those systems and tools and techniques that they have in place is always going to be the best bet. Generally, that's going to involve systems that are more sophisticated and more secure than what you can do as an individual. But as an individual or as a small organization that doesn't have the resources or the staff or the organizational structure to support a large IT or information security department, these methods of two-factor authentication are going to be great for you. And if you are in charge of digital security, or just you're the person that sets up the Google Drive accounts or the G Suite accounts for your organization, or Microsoft 365, or whatever it is that your organization uses, in a lot of instances, you administratively can enforce two-factor authentication at the organizational level. And anytime you can do that, you should. The second thing we're talking about in this risk category, in credentials risk, is using a password manager. Now, when it comes to passwords, everyone should regularly change their passwords. Everyone should use strong passwords whenever they can, meaning strong, complex passwords that aren't just normal words or your own name or your address or a pet's name or something like that. And you should use different passwords for every platform. A password manager makes it easy to do all three of those things. First of all, password managers like LastPass or 1Password, and there's a lot of choices here, so don't lock into just those. They act as an encrypted vault, keeping track of your passwords. Theoretically, you only have to know one difficult password, and then the rest of your passwords are sort of behind this wall and no one can get at them. The most robust versions also have a browser plugin for ease of use, so that you don't always have to have your device out when you're surfing the internet. If you've got a browser plugin installed for whatever password manager you're using, it can grab those passwords for when you're trying to log into whatever website you're trying to get at, and that just makes it a little easier to use while still keeping everything behind that wall. Password managers are also good for being able to check across your internet accounts for reused username and password pairs, or to see if you use the same password on a bunch of different platforms. You shouldn't do those things. A lot of password managers make it easy to check and make sure that you're not doing that, or to offer suggestions for how to fix that. A password manager can also help you generate strong passwords. It's not a human thing to generate a strong password where you have a bunch of random numbers and letters and symbols that would be hard to crack. But a machine is very good at generating a fully randomized strong password. And a good password manager is going to give you the opportunity to do that. Again, if you're in charge of your organization's platforms, if you control your G Suite or your Office 365 or whatever it is, and you can enforce strong passwords at the admin level, you should go ahead and do that. And if everyone in your organization is on a team version of a password manager, then a lot of times that app will help them in generating strong passwords. Lastly, most password managers have tools baked in that make it easy for you to share passwords securely with your colleagues or with your family members or with anyone you want to send passwords to. This helps you avoid committing the cardinal, most gnarly sin of texting or emailing passwords to other people, which you should never, ever do. The last dimension of this risk category, when we're thinking about credentials risk, is phishing attempts and how to recognize them. The definition of phishing is an attempt by an outside party to gain access to login credentials or sensitive information by fraudulent means, specifically by impersonating a legitimate or trustworthy individual or platform or institution, and doing so by way of electronic communication. In common language, this means they'll send you an email or direct you to a website that is supposed to look like something that you would normally want to log into, like a major platform or a financial institution or something like that. It's designed to look legit, but this website or email is specifically built to try and steal your login credentials for whatever institution or platform it's impersonating. The usual goal is to convince you to enter in specifically login credentials or other personal information, but login credentials are the real prize. And by doing that, then they capture this, and then the sort of the bad actor on the other side now not only has login information for one specific platform, but because they take advantage of people's bad habits and poor personal operations security, it's a good bet that if that's the username and password pair for a major platform, it's probably going to work on other major platforms as well. So now you sort of have your own personal data breach cooked up, where someone is taking a known working credentials pair and trying it in as many places as they can. The most common method for this kind of message to get delivered to you is either through some sort of an instant message, would be a link to a website, has a short link, seems fine when you get there, so long as you don't investigate it closely at all. And a lot of people do things on autopilot and then don't, which is why if you receive an instant message with a link to a website, you should be careful about clicking on links no matter what. And if you weren't necessarily expecting to get an instant message from a financial institution or a major platform, maybe don't click on the thing. Almost no platform or major institution is going to ask you for login information in that sort of way. So if you're just engaged in a little bit of digital risk awareness and thinking, you'll know not to do that. But if you do, and you find yourself on a website that feels weird, investigate things, make sure links are where they're supposed to go, look at the URL, and make sure that it seems like a real Google or Microsoft or Wells Fargo URL or whatever it is. Just do a little bit of due diligence before you engage in anything like that. But generally, if you've had any sort of phishing training at all, if you're familiar with the concept, you'll know kind of how that's not supposed to look. The more sinister version of this usually comes in an email. And it can come from a trusted source, either from a spoofed email, so it looks like it comes from somebody that you know, or it looks like it comes from another legitimate source like a major platform or institution. And the email version of phishing is very effective. And a lot of blood and treasure is expended every year in trying to fight the threat of phishing and trying to really get people so that they in a place where they can recognize a phishing attempt. Sometimes phishing is used for, rather than trying to gain credentials or access to a platform, a version of this sometimes is used to steal money by way of false invoices, where someone will spoof an email from within an institution and send a fake invoice and say, hey, pay this now, to someone else in what's been identified as a finance department, or it's just a big dragnet and they're hoping it's going to catch somebody's eye that would have the power to pay an invoice. And then they do, and then that money is gone. So the best sort of rule you can have in these situations is, and we'll talk a little bit about this when we get to malware as well, but if you find yourself in a situation where you are receiving an email with an attachment or with an invoice or with anything sort of hooked to it that you didn't expect to receive, whether it's from an individual or a colleague or an institution, there is never a downside to following up and double checking and making sure that that individual or that institution actually sent you that email and really wants you to do whatever it is they're asking you to do in that message. Just taking a few extra minutes can save you a whole lot of heartache in the long run. Now, phishing very often is a big randomized operation meant to fish, meant to troll the waters and look for as many people as they can catch in their net as possible. They'll do it in batches of thousands or tens of thousands, where they're just seeding the waters and sending a ton of emails out and hoping they're going to get a few people that will fall for it and will go and use whatever it is they're trying to get you to use. There is a version of this that is more targeted, and that's called spear phishing. Spear phishing is a targeted version of phishing in which a specific organization or individual is targeted by a malevolent external party. This is not just a big random attack where a script or an automated bot is just looking for ways in and trying to grab money and cause trouble. This is specifically an attempt to gain access to that target organization's sensitive information, materials, platforms, finances, whatever it is they might be going after. There have been a lot of high-profile examples of spear phishing in the last couple of years, and just know that it is specifically and decidedly different than the randomized phishing attack. You may not be part of an organization or be an individual that is high-profile enough or ends up in a situation in which you will be specifically targeted. But the good news is that if you know how to recognize a general phishing attempt, then that same skill set and instinct is applicable in learning to recognize a spear phishing attempt. One more detail about phishing and spear phishing. Phishing is different than hacking. Hacking is an intrusion by an external actor that makes use of generally relatively advanced technological means to gain unauthorized access to or control of either a network or a device. Phishing is not hacking and involves the unauthorized or fraudulent acquisition of usernames, passwords, login credentials in order to gain access to platforms in a way that is illegal and unauthorized. They have some similarities, but functionally they are different, and they are different kinds of risks. To close out this type of risk, credentials risk, the most important thing to understand is that safeguarding your passwords and your access to platforms is extremely important and is one of the easiest kinds of risks to mitigate, even though it is one of the most destructive kinds of risks. If you use a password manager, if you use two-factor authentication, and if you are vigilant and don't check your email on autopilot and really are engaged and risk aware when you're sort of navigating your digital environment, your tools, your work throughout the day, it is not hard to protect yourself from having your accounts being compromised. You just have to be intentional about it. You do have to do a little bit of extra work, but having good passwords, using a password manager, and using two-factor authentication does a lot of the work in this instance, and then learning to recognize phishing attacks and being well prepared to guard against those really does the rest of it.